Hey folks, how are you? This is Jack Howard here. Thanks for coming. As you know, or as you may know, I am the author of Practical HDRI, High Dynamic Range Imaging. High Dynamic Range Imaging using Photoshop CS5 and other tools, the second edition of my book, Practical HDRI. This book is in pre-order on Amazon. It's due out a little bit later this summer. I'm going to be referencing a number of websites during this, and every site that I'll be linking to or talking about is here in this Twitter stream here, twitter.com/practicalhdri. So let's get started. I'm going to go over here to Bridge, talk a little bit about high dynamic range imaging, which is a multiple shot technique for expanding the dynamic range of your photos. There's a lot to take in with HDRI. It's a multi-shot technique. There's software. There's field work that needs to be done. There's a lot of misconceptions about what HDRI is on the Internet. HDRI is just a very, very big image space. It's much bigger than 8 or 16-bit image space. As you can see here in this shot, I've got lamps, snow, and even the stars in this shot in a walkway in Breckenridge, Colorado. The range of exposures in this shot on the Canon 1D Mark III range from about 1/125th of a second up to about 25 seconds on a very, very cold night. Here you can see I have got neon and daylight and even the lights inside the office buildings with a lot of great detail and not a lot of haloing. Here in the Grand Canyon, we've got shadow detail, clouds, sky, and very, very little clip, and very, very little haloing. There's a lot of HDR photography online that is hyper-tone mapped, surreal grunge. That's one style of HDRI photography, but that is not all that HDRI photography is, and that's a point that I try to make anytime I am giving a presentation. And as you can see with my own work, it ranges from very, very photorealistic. This is a view out a window at a casino, the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas, showing the backside of the Strip all the way through the mountains. There's very, very little clip. There's good shadow detail, and there's not that excess of halos or grunge. This is very photorealistic, as is this shot, showing the interior and the exterior of that same room at the Flamingo with a nice view back to some of the hills in the background. Of course, you can, because it's such a huge image space and there's so much data available, you can also push the color and the detail. And as you see here, there is a little bit of contrast, edge contrast, and haloing that is going to happen when you have such high contrast edges. It's just managing it is part of learning the HDRI workflow and where your personal comfort and style and aesthetic is and how much you want to push and pull. We'll get to how to manage that in a little bit as soon as I'm done with the slideshow. Here again you can see one of the things that the HDR process is great at is excellent pixel detail throughout the tonal range. There's very, very little shadow noise and no clip anywhere in this series of shots from Bermuda. The series of shots from Bermuda that wound up being this single HDRI tone-mapped image. This is the cover of the second edition of the book. Again, we've got shadows and very blue sky and everything in between in a single shot. Again, here there's very little clip, virtually no clip. One thing you do see here is a tiny little bit of ghosting of these two swans, because again, this is a multiple shot technique. There's ways to handle ghosting, but that is an issue that you've got to be concerned with when you're doing a multiple shot technique and merging them, which is at the core of HDRI process. The HDRI process. HDR photography is a multiple shot process. There really is not such a thing at the present with consumer grade cameras as single shot HDR photography, regardless of what some people think and what some people call HDR photography. That's simply throwing an HDR operator at a single image. It does not significantly expand the dynamic range, and it doesn't give you all of the gains of the HDRI process. one of the classic examples of when to use HDR photography is the Cathedral with stained glass. Here you've got stained glass detail and interior detail. As you can see, there's a tiny bit of clip here where there is an open window. This was a handheld 5-shot burst with a Pentax K7 with shots ranging from -4, -2, 0, +2, and +4. And in that one shutter burst in 1 second, I just was not able to get enough tonal range to get any detail in the exterior, but the interior is what I was looking for. And again, here, this is just a fun experiment. And one thing that's interesting to note with this picture is there's great depth of field. This is f/22 on Pentax 10-17 fisheye lens, but you can see some blade refraction here, focus blade refraction in these trees. It's a little bit of an artifact that you get with really stopping down in the HDRI effect to amplify that in this image. Here's another shot. This is 3 shots with the -2, 0, +2 with the original Canon EOS 5D from the top of the Arc de Triomphe. It's got a sort of an old-fashioned postcard feel on it. I just love the clouds in the sky and the colors in this one. And this here, again, is a very photorealistic result. Not a lot of haloing even here on these high-contrast edges. And the way you do this is by capturing the full dynamic range of the scene. And let's go right into that, and let's take a look at how to capture the full dynamic range of the scene. Let me just pop out here. There's no magic number. There's not a magic number as to how many shots you need to capture. What you must do is capture the full dynamic range of the scene, whether that takes 3 shots, 5 shots, 7 shots. There's nothing sacred about odd numbers either. It's just that most cameras tend to bracket based on a 0 setting and throw negative and positive values on either side. So you get a set that is 3, 5, 7, 9, or 11. If one of those shots doesn't give anything significant to the image, you can throw it out. Don't get hung up on the exact number of shots. What's important is to capture the full dynamic range of the scene. And the way you do that is by making sure that you've got black, very, very clipped images on both ends. This image here, which is very dark, is going to give us the great highlights. And moving through here, you can see that the histogram migrates towards white clip. And by doing this, we ensure that by capturing a series of images that go from significantly clipped on one end to the other, we ensure that we have an HDRI file when we merge that has no clipped pixels and captures the full dynamic range of the scene. I hope everyone is following that so far. We'll take a look at another example. Here we go. Open all these up in Adobe Camera Raw. Here's the median image, because that's the way that the Nikon D3 was set the day I was shooting with this. And then here's the darkest image. As you can see, it's very clipped. We go through all of these, and we go all the way up to white clip. And these here, the brightest picture is going to give us the absolute darkest pixel values in our final HDR image. It's a little counterintuitive, but it makes sense once you get the hang of it. So hopefully everyone is following along with that so far. Again, the thing that's important is to capture the full dynamic range of the scene. And different cameras have different settings. If you go to the Practical HDRI Twitter stream, you can see where I have a link to an article I wrote for my day job with Adorama Camera, where I'm the director of new and social media, titled My Favorite Cameras for HDRI Photography, 2009 HDR All-Stars. These are cameras that can shoot a series of raw images, minimum requirements of being able to bracket -3 to +3 in RAW in less than 1 second. These are some of my favorite cameras in market right now for HDR photography. Let's take a little bit of a look at Bridge and organizing some of your shots with Adobe Bridge. I know Lightroom is immensely popular with photographers, but for HDRI workflow, Bridge is better because it has full support of EXR and HDRI 32-bit files. Right here we have got images grouped, and these are all of my source files. Normally I'd be working off of RAW, but today I'm working off of downsample tips because the rendering time and the processing time for HDRI processing takes a while. And we'd be sitting here watching Photoshop render as opposed to talking a little bit about it. Here you can see I have got more groups. These are groups I've already made. The way that you make a group of images in Bridge is you highlight all of your images, go up to Stack, and Group as Stack. There, right arrow, left arrow expands them out. And as you can see, it's just a simple matter of grouping and ungrouping. You've got to make sure that you've got all of your images selected before you merge it, because if you click on this and then go to Tools, Photoshop, merge to HDR Pro, you're going to get an error because you need multiple images selected for that process to work. So let's go ahead and we're going to go back to this Brooklyn Bridge. It's actually the Manhattan Bridge image. And select this entire stack, and we are going to go up to Tools, Photoshop, merge to HDR Pro. And we're going to combine the data from all of these images into one single image. This message here is just because I'm working off of TIFFs and not RAW files, and it's going to give you a warning. But again, that's because we want to do this for a screen display, and otherwise we would just be watching the computer render for much, much longer than we normally would be. As you can see, even with downsample files, this process does take a little bit of time. And here you go. Here is the Merge to HDR window. And as you can see, this file here is the result of all of these source files. And as you can see, this has the tonal range of the entire source image set. And this white point here where you set this is going to set your camera. This is going to set where the white point opens in Adobe Photoshop with your exposure slider, so you want to get that close to middle. CS5 has finally, Adobe finally has a ghost removal option in their HDR workflow in CS5, and we're going to zoom in and look at a little bit of ghosts up here, right at the top of the Manhattan Bridge. As you can see, we've got this helicopter, and we can select and change which source image we're going to use as our anchor image. That's going to be our green anchor image. I'm going to get rid of that top image. I think these two are causing me problems. As you can see, we've now gotten rid of that helicopter and the ghosting, and the flag up here is looking a bit more crisp and sharp. One trick I like to do, I normally don't go straight into tone mapping at this point, but when I am looking for ghosts, I do very quickly switch over to the tone map window because I find that you can check out ghosts much more easily at all exposure levels if you just really crank up your settings to see if you have any ghosts when you go over to tone mapping. But I prefer to open this into Photoshop and save the 32-bit file so that I don't have to re-merge every time I feel like working on an image. I hope this is making sense so far. Again, let's go back to Bridge for 1 second, and I'm going to put myself on mute and clear my throat for 1 second. Excuse me. We're going to go back to Bridge. We're going to look at one more thing in Bridge, which is keywording. There are source files can be keyworded. However, the OpenEXR file type, which is the one of the 32-bit file types for HDRI photography, does not support keywording. So that sort of creates some problems. One of the things I do is I always save my 32-bit file with some of the keywords, some of the top-level keywords, such as Hawaii. Those are things that I would keyword this top image into, or the 32-bit file I'm going to make. And interestingly, if you have, this has multiple values, and some of these source images I have different values on, like this one might say blue, this one's going to say palm tree. The resultant image will inherit all of the source keywords from all of the source files. But the 32-bit files generally don't support keywords. Photoshop document, PSD, 32-bit files do support keywords, but those are gigantic, bloat-filled, giant files that you really don't want to be using too much. They don't play nice between different programs, and they gobble up significant amounts of hard drive space. So that's a bit of what you can do with Bridge in terms of organizing your files. Again, if you want to clean this up, you can shrink and compress your stacks, and that's it. So that is getting us through a bit of the HDR merge. So over here in Photoshop, we have that HDR file, and as you can see, we've got some dirt up there. This exposure point slider down here, again, is going to show you that entire tonal range that we're going to work with and try to tone map down to 32-bit space via the tone map operators. Photoshop has, for reasons which, popularity right now, has an adjustment in here called HDR toning. And this brings up your HDR tone map window. But this has some, I have some issues with this. True, it does have the exact same settings as the bit dropping tone mapping we're going to get into. Yes, this can also be used for for tone mapping a single image of any bit depth. But one of the problems with this is, as you can see, it's going to return this 32-bit file, which is actually rendering a little bit dark right now. It's going to return it to 32-bit space as a tone-mapped HDR file. And from there, you've still got to get this down to lower bit space. This is fine if you want to do something quick and dirty, if you want to work on a single image. But it's not really true HDR photography when you do that. So instead, let's take a look at this Bermuda image. Let me track that down. My computer is going a little bit sluggishly because of the screen drawing, so I've already merged this, and I'm going to pull up and open this EXR that is the result of that source file to look at this one instead. As you can see here, this image contains all of the information from those source images, and we've got very, very nice tonal information. And when we pull this into lower bit space via mode, 16 bits or 8-bit drop, there's a lot of adjustments we can make. This is the main tone map window in Adobe Photoshop. Local adaptation is really the trophy aggressive tone mapper in Adobe Photoshop. There's also a lot of 32-bit work that you can do, which we'll cover in a little while, but let's take a look at just basic tone mapping. Radius and strength, these two settings are going to affect luminance masking, and these are how you can push or pull your edge glow. We're going to leave them right where they are to start. Gamma, positive gamma values push more of the tonal range into the screen gamut. Lower gamma settings push away from that. There's more contrast, but numbers can be off-screen, values can be off-screen. Exposure, of course, adjust your overall exposure, bright or dark. Detail, positive detail values really crank up your detail. And again, in conjunction with gamma, you can really go for that grunge effect. You can work with a combination of these to get a feel for what you want. Again, a shadow works with shadow, of course, is going to boost your shadow, and highlight is going to crank up your highlight detail. There's no single right way to tone map, but one of the things you want to do is make sure that you don't have significant clip. The entire point of things with HDR photography is to expand the dynamic range of that 32-bit space and compress it into the lower bit space. So if we're getting clip anywhere you've got to adjust your exposure a little bit. And again, gamma is one way to do that. And yes, this is going to be very, very confusing because until you get the hang of it, you can just go crazy with pushing and pulling these sliders until you really get a feel for it. So you've also got the curves control, you've got corners. These are just another way to push and pull the information and open up or increase or decrease contrast. Vibrance and saturation. Vibrance boosts the red, green, and blue channels, boosts or diminishes saturation, cranks up colors universally. It's easy to go overboard with these settings, particularly saturation. I find that vibrance has a much more subtle feel to it than saturation, so I tend to lean with that, lean on that setting a little bit harder than saturation. I hope that is making a bit of sense. But let's just cancel out of this, and again, we're going to bring this image back up into 32-bit space and look at a couple of other things that you can do. Photoshop is unique in the fact that you can do local selections, and if I pull up, certain tools work and certain tools don't work. But for example, here I'm just going to make a very coarse, loose selection over the sky and tighten this up. Go to Refine Edge, and I can feather this out. And one of the things that's nice about the new Refine Edge dialog box is you can export to a selection to a new layer with a layer mask. So you click OK. And up here, one of the things that's very cool and unique about Adobe Photoshop is the ability for these local selections. So from here, I can adjust the exposure. Let's show the background layer as well. Excuse me for 1 second. So as you can see here, I'm working on the background copy layer with a very loose selection on the sky, but I can adjust the exposure and the gamma correction locally, which is something that you cannot do in most other programs. Only Adobe Photoshop offers this ability to make local selections. As you can see, there are a number of adjustments that you can make globally or locally, but there's also a number that you can't. But I prefer to be happy with the tool set that you have, as opposed to complaining about what you can't. It's just it's something that Photoshop has. It's pretty cool. For selections, you have the quick selection tool. If we go back to our background layer, turn that on. The quick selection tool works, but for example, the magic wand tool does not. There's some tools that don't. You go up to the lasso tool works, but the magnetic lasso tool doesn't. It's again, it's just part of the way that working in 32-bit space in Adobe Photoshop and the tools that they have added and have activated in 32-bit mode, what you've got and what you don't. I go into much more detail on some of these expanded advanced soft mapping techniques on the two videos that you can see here on vimeo.com channel/HDR photography. These videos here are done with Adobe Photoshop CS4 extended. However, almost everything in these videos translates to CS5 unchanged and works in the non-extended version, which is a very nice touch. It was very, very good to see, and I was very happy to see that they had moved many of the adjustment layers and some of the brushes down to the non-extended version. Someone just asked, will they add more 32-bit features? I don't know that at this point. I can't really speak for Adobe right now. So, excuse me for one more second. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I just had a tiny bit of a coughing fit, so I put myself on mute. Let's take a look at tone mapping, another image. Here's an image that a lot of people like, which is a shot, an HDR shot of a boxer by the name of Johnny Douglas, who I photographed at Gleason's Gym in Brooklyn a few years back. This is a multiple shot HDR shot. I did not use all of these source images. I used a selection of them to cover this tonal range. And this image, it's not perfect. There's a couple of problems with it. There is some motion blur in the background. If you zoom in very closely, you can see that there are a little bit of soft edges on the boxing gloves. I was shooting this handheld with the Nikon D3. The boxer was trying to stand as still as he could, but there are some imperfections along the edges. HDR photography works best with still subjects and a tripod. Here's a chance where I gambled, and I'm okay with the fact that there's a tiny bit of ghosting along the edges. Again, I'm going to go to mode. You can go to either 8 bits or 16 bits a channel and drop down, and that's going to launch your HDR toning window. And again, here you've just got to select your settings that are best going to give you the feel of what you want to do with all of the information that you've got. Do you really want to accentuate that detail? Do you want to open up the shadows? Do you want to boost the vibrance and the saturation? As you can see, as we do this, you can see that some of these edges are getting more and more pronounced. You can see, here's a good example of what the edge glow settings are going to do as you change these. It softens up those sort of haloed edges a little bit and gives a little bit of forgiveness to the ghosted edges there. I don't know how I can make this point any more clear that HDR photography is all about your personal vision, and you can choose to tone map this as grunge or as photorealistic as you want. And the more information you capture and the more information you have in your source HDR file, the more flexibility you have. And it doesn't necessarily yield less dramatic results, but less surreal results. Just the edges look a lot more crisp. There's also a number of presets in here, and here's one that Photoshop calls the preloads, and they call photorealistic. I'd have to tend to agree with that. They've got high contrast, which I'm not quite sure why. I mean, here's one low contrast. And something like this would be good if you just want to capture more dynamic range, get it photorealistic, and then when you have this down into your lower bit space, because now I'm in 8-bit space, to go with some of your just traditional techniques to add a little bit of snap, either with levels or curves. That's some of the really cool things that Photoshop CS5 is capable of in HDRI photography. I hope I'm. I hope that's clear to a lot of people. We've got a little bit of time left, so I'm thinking now's a good time to open up to some questions and answers. And maybe I can illustrate some points off of questions and answers. So, Catherine, you want to throw some questions my way?
Sure. I was just picking up my phone again. And again, folks, I know that I'm coming through a little quietly, so please bear with us. So, Jeff's just asking right now, can you address the issue of noise? And I think that's probably
we're talking about noise in HDR images, not noise on the phone line right now, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Okay, perfect. That's a fantastic question. Noise, the HDRI process, by capturing the full dynamic range of the scene, is a naturally noise-reducing operation. When you have more of your source pixels for your shadows, more towards the middle of the histogram, as I explained when we've got, here's your half pipe this way and your half pipe that way of your histograms with your quarter pipes. You're getting better quality pixels at all levels of exposure. And as you can see here, when we zoom in, I'm just going to do a very quick mapping on this image. Let me pull up the tone mapping thing. As you can see under here, this is the darkest spot on this image. And when I go to tone map this, you're going to notice that there's very, very little noise even in the shadow land, because these pixels originated towards the middle of the histogram, and the way that your digital camera captures information, the digital camera sensor captures information, these pixels, your shadow pixels, are going to have significantly less noise because of the HDRI process. And as you can see, this is the darkest spot in this image, and there is virtually no shadow noise whatsoever. Depending on, of course, that's depending on the ISO and your camera's noise characteristics in general at a given ISO. I don't know if you can ever truly get past the perfect number, but the HDRI process, when you capture the full dynamic range of the scene, is a naturally noise-reducing process in and of itself. Does that answer it?
Okay, thanks. Let me see. I'm trying to organize these logically. So back at the beginning, Monica did ask if these effects can be done with Photoshop CS4.
Yes and no. There are certain things that can be done with Adobe Photoshop CS4 Extended, including the layers and the adjustment layer techniques. But the tone mapping, the local adaptation tone map window in CS4 is basically just the curves control, which, give me 1 second to pull it up again. You have the radius and strength. You don't have tone and detail, but you do have the tone and curve and histogram, so you have got to manually adjust everything off of the curves. You've got curves and you've got cornered curves, and that's how CS4 worked. It was and is very, very powerful, and this curves control has its places when you want to pin down a specific spot on your histogram. You can, and as you can see here, I'm just picking points, and I can now just adjust right there in the sky where I touched on the curve. But it is very, very nuanced. See, it was a real pain to work with. It had its certain challenges. You miss the tone and detail with the local adaptation slider. So HDR in CS5 is a pretty big upgrade, and especially the fact that they migrated a lot of the adjustment layers feature set from extended down to the regular product is a fantastic fantastic bonus for HDR shooters, if you ask me. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, good. That does make sense. I mean, it made sense to me. I'm hoping it did to Monica and other people as well. So then John has asked a couple questions about portraits, and he wanted to know, are there examples of HDRI tone mapping done in portraits or people? And then he asked a second time, how about HDRI portraits with 2 or 3 captures?
Exactly. I showed the example of Johnny Douglas, the boxer.
Right.
Your choices with portraiture are to have a camera that has very good high ISO performance and a very fast burst rate and a good bracket sequence and auto exposure bracket sequence that can do a couple of shots in just a blitz of a second, or section of a second, in order to limit subject movement. If you're going to try this, I suggest using a tripod, because if you're trying to hold the camera still and the subject is trying to hold still, there's a lot of moving variables there. It can be done. This is one of those examples where if you really want that HDRI feel and you do not have a extreme dynamic range, you can go that HDR toning route. However, you're not going to gain the advantages of the full HDRI process, such as very, very clean shadow tones with minimal noise. When you go the single-shot HDR toning route, you do run the risk of amplifying that shadow noise. And even if you've got a camera that has good noise control, just in a single shot, the HDRI, the local adaptation processor, searches for contrast and will amplify that contrast, particularly noise. So, gamble. Take the shots, bracket them, do a quick bracket with a camera such as say the Canon 5D Mark II that can shoot an AAB sequence of -3.0 and +3 in 3 shots very, very quickly. And if if it doesn't work and they're not aligned or the subject moves, if you want to get that feel, because I know a lot of people like that feel right now, and if you have to go the HDR toning route, go the HDR toning route. Which brings me to another point. When you go the HDR toning route, one of the problems inherent with this workflow is it brings you back up to 32-bit. It brings you back to the space that you started in. So if you start with an HDR shot, it's going to bring you back up to 32-bit space. But here's a shot of my dog Bailey, and when I go HDR toning, it brings up the tone map dialog box. I push on gamma. I go, look, I want to post this picture on Flickr and give it that whole ultra noise, ultra grunge sort of edge feel, crank up that vibrance and saturation to the nth degree. There you go. I could then apply some sharpening or whatever I want, or just pull this back a little bit, do whatever I'm going to do, and watch what happens. Here it's in 32, then it goes back down to 8. When I take this shot, here's an HDR. When I have this image, I've got to go back in my history panel here for a second. Where is my history panel? Go back to the original image. So now I've just got this. When I go to Image, Adjustments, HDR Toning, it brings up the HDR Toning dialog box. If I go Gamma, I can go here. I can load a preset, which I've got. And here we go. Let's try this one. Load in a preset. See what happens. There you go. I've got that ultra grungerific feel. If that's what you want. It's not really my style, but you can do that. Here I am in 32-bit space. I click OK, and it brings me back to 32-bit space. And so now I have a tone-mapped image that is a low dynamic range image that lives in 32-bit space. What do I have to do? I have to drop the bit depth in order to get this into Flickr, Facebook, wherever, so I can go to 8 bits or 16 bits per channel. And here I am. I'm a local adaptation. Where's the escape hatch? The escape hatch is here, exposure and gamma. This is a 32-bit preview option, and it's what you see is what you get. And that's how you get out of the HDR toning when you've got if you ever use HDR toning command on a 32-bit image and you wind up back in 32-bit space and need to get down, go to exposure and gamma and don't touch anything, and that will get you back down to back down to lower bit space with the effect that you just applied.
Okay.
So I think that more than answers that.
Yes, there have been a few questions about the 32-bit, and for instance, where was that question? One person, Scott, said that he missed the part where you're talking about the 32-bit images not supporting tags, and was hoping that you could explain that again. And Irene also said, why is 32-bit a problem? So, could you address those?
Yes, absolutely. 32-bit space is not a problem in and of itself. It's just that the OpenEXR file type wasn't really designed for photography. This was originally, I believe, it's a high dynamic range image space, and it's got many, many different uses. So it was not built to support originally the IPTC standards. So if you have your keyworded source images, depending on what program you use, you may or may not inherit them or have them wind up in your entire, in your output image or in your 32-bit file. So let's go ahead and, where I look at this, if I show you here, these images, they all have, blue, green, Hawaii. These are keywords that I have in my image. Okay, so let's go ahead and merge this to HDR under, again, Photoshop Tools, merge to HDR Pro. There's that warning because I'm using small demo files for this screencast. And we'll just go ahead and let that render for a second. And it just hung there for a second, so let me just try that once more. Photoshop merge to HDR Pro. Here we go. Now it's running through the script. And again, here we've got, we're merging our HDR, and this is going to result in a 32-bit file. And then we click OK. And we go over here to File, File Info. Here in Photoshop, it has the keywords. But if I take this program if I take this EXR shot into another program such as Photomatix, FDR Tools, or HDR Photo Studio, and exported, those keywords may not come along with it. There's no standard for what information comes along in the IPTC in a OpenEXR 32-bit file at this point. So that's the issue with it. The workaround I have for that is I will slug this 32-bit file that's the result of these source images with some of the top-level source images. So, for example, I'm going to save this as Kauai Hotel Lobby. I'm going to save this as an EXR, which is a 32-bit file type. And there, it at least is going to be, it's going to have some of the same keywords that are embedded in my source images in that file name to help me search and sort should it get lost or separated. And in a perfect world, as you can see, I will save that back to, I'm going to save everything associated, all the file types, like, here I've got my 32-bit EXR file that's the result of this merge saved back into a image stack with the source images there in Bridge. And again, that one's called, where did it go? Bermuda Carving Small, and Bermuda Carvings is a keyword for these source images. That way, if they get separated or lost, or I accidentally save it to somewhere else, I can find it on my hard drive via keywords. And of course, I can then also go back, and if I want, with my resultant file, after I save my low-bit tone-mapped image, go back and grab or paste or export keywords from a source image into the final image. So that's just one of the issues. And again, with Lightroom 3 is a great program. It does a lot, but it does not support 32-bit image types. And if you're in Lightroom and you do your right click and you click on that, it's going to pass off. It's going to pass off merged HDR to CS5. It does not support 32-bit space. It has some plugins that can help you get your photos and round trip them into Lightroom, but it doesn't. It's not fully supporting 32-bit space at that point. So I hope that helps.
Okay, good. Thank you for going into so much detail. So just for clarity, Christine was asking, does Photoshop CS5 come with a complete tonal mapping features, or is that an add-on, an additional plugin?
Everything that I've worked on today and shown you today is part of the Adobe Photoshop CS5 product. I was very, very strict in making sure that everything that I touched today, Bridge, Adobe Camera Raw, and Photoshop and the tone mapping, that's all what you get for when you buy CS5.
Okay. Okay. So we have a few more minutes for questions. I just want to say I've been told that we're going to have a fire alarm test at 11 o'clock, which isn't 9 minutes here. So if I suddenly go mute, if we're not off by that time, then that's what's going on. So should be exciting.
I've been waiting for my dog alarm to go off any minute, and she's been amazingly calm this entire time.
So Simo, I don't know how to say the name, asked about the edge glow settings. Do they work independent from the tone and detail sliders, or are they calculating a mask through which the other sliders are processed?
That kind of goes to the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. It's really, it's yes and no. The settings are based upon image size, the radius and the strength, and they affect the relationship of the bright and dark and contrast edges. So let me just push myself here to a point where I've got some good detail and some color to work with, and then we'll explore those a little bit. You crank up radius, the more you crank this up, the softer it's going to be. You've got much more soft edges, and strength modifies the way that effect works. And of course here it's like, we just push some things out of, screen gamut. So if we crank gamut up a bit more, we're going to get more in. But then, we've got that edge glow effect that, is now getting a little crazy. And here we've got, our exterior shadows are on parity, if not darker than these interior shadows. I find that the way that the base settings are usually calculated pretty well, and they are set to load in based on the image size. So if you're shooting with, if you're got a 3 megapixel picture or a 20 megabyte picture, something that's 1,000 pixels across or 4,000 pixels across, the preloaded settings here are going to vary a little bit in order to be pretty close to optimal. I generally leave these close to where they are. I might just push and pull them a tiny bit. Does that help?
Well, I hope so. So maybe you can let us know if that didn't answer the question, but that was a good answer. Let me see. We have a few general questions here. And I think Robert was asking the best way to bracket your exposures. Do you do it in manual or AV with shutter speed, or what do you recommend?
How do I bracket my exposures? It depends on the camera I'm using. In my work, I do get to experiment and evaluate a lot of cameras. I generally try to assess the scene and hope that I can do it with one touch of the shutter button on an auto exposure bracket sequence. That depends on the camera. Certain cameras that I tend to use a lot in favor for HDR photography are the Pentax K7, which can do 5 shots at up to a 5-shot burst. It's -4, -2, 0, +2, and +4 in under a second. I love the Nikon D3, the Nikon D3S, which can do 9 shots at 1 EV spacing in a second. I love the Canon 1D Mark III for what it could do for HDRI photography, which is pretty much cover the entire known universe in an exposure bracket sequence if you tweak your custom functions to set maximum offset to -3, so you can shoot from about -9 to +9 around your metered exposure. It depends on what your camera can do. The most important thing to do is chimp the histograms and make sure that you have clipped dark pixels, clipped white and clipped dark, clipped black in your extreme shots. If you need to, if your camera only has, say a 3-shot AEB burst that goes to -2, 0, and +2 as a maximum, one of my favorite things to do is combine your auto exposure bracket with exposure compensation and set your exposure compensation to -2, and then set your exposure compensation to +2. And you need a tripod for this. And so when you set your exposure compensation to -2 and shoot an AEB sequence of 3 shots, you're getting -4, -2, and 0. And then you set it to +2, and then you've got a shot that's the sequence that starts at 0 and goes 0, +2, and +4. Throw out one of those 0 shots, the middle shots, and you've got a shot with a couple of pushes of the button. You've got -4, 2, 0, 2, 4. It depends on your camera setting. Dig into your camera settings and research. Also, double-check your camera manual to see if your auto exposure bracketing sequence is going to change shutter speed or aperture or both. In a perfect world, you only want it to change the shutter speed, because if you change the aperture, you're going to change the pixel characteristics, bokeh, and depth of field and the focal plane characteristics of the images, and that can create some weird artifacts. Depending on your camera, again, there's so many cameras in market, they differ in what they can do, but usually aperture value or manual is going to just change the shutter speed. Check your camera manual. We've got time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay, that was great. You're talking fast. Eileen was asking, and you may have just answered this. She says that she shoots a lot of bugs, birds, and frogs. It sounds like a hunter. And it's hard to get multiple images. So she asked, do you have any advice for that? Again, you probably need a camera that takes very fast.
Yes, you want to have a camera that can blast a series of shots. I mean, basically the advice I just gave. The bugs, birds, they're the same as, people or moving subjects. It's impossible to shoot true HDR photography of professional sports because that's a moving subject. HDR photography works best when you have a still subject, a still scene, and can capture that without there being any moving elements in the scene. And it's one of those things where it's going to be trial and error. And if you shoot more shots, you don't have to use all of your source images, but if you shoot a couple and you can get a couple that are aligned and a couple where the edges line up, give it a shot.
Okay. And then one last question, which I think is a good one and quick. Do the individual images have to be aligned pixel for pixel, or does CS5 do some of the alignment for you?
Here's another one of those things where you're better off. If you use a tripod and your camera doesn't move, they're going to absolutely be aligned. Photoshop CS5 and virtually every other third-party HDRI program, HDRI merging program in market has some degree of manual or automatic image alignment. But you're taking a chance. The more drift there is pixel drift between images, the more likely you are that they're not going to line perfectly. I do I do regularly shoot handheld with super fast cameras and trust that the alignment is going to work. Sometimes it works. Sometimes I get upset with myself that I took a shortcut. But sometimes it's just not time to set up a tripod. A tripod is your best way to go, but alignment can work if you're lucky, and if you're shooting with a wide-angle lens, that also helps.
Okay, wonderful. So, Jack, thank you. Thank you for sharing all this information with us and for sharing your gorgeous photos. I don't think the technology today did them justice, but they were beautiful nonetheless. And why don't you tell us about your book and your Twitter page, et cetera, again?
Okay, as I said, Practical HDRI, high dynamic range imaging using Photoshop CS5 and other tools, is due on bookshelves in late August. It is published by the fine folks over at Rocky Nook and distributed by our friends, Riley, who are hosting this today. It is the second edition of this book. The first one came out in 2008. This one is a major update. I've included Unified Colors HDR Photo Studio, updated workflows for Photomatix Pro, FDR tools, Dynamic Photo HDR, and of course Adobe Photoshop CS5. It is a significant rewrite. The original edition was 168 pages. This one clocks in at 240 in order to accommodate all of the new information. And it's a lot of fun. A lot of the I go into a lot more detail of the tips and tricks and techniques, both from shooting and digital darkroom, that we cover here in the book. Everything I've talked about today, you can find some very useful links over here on this page, the twitter.com/practicalhdri. The Christian Block's HDR Labs forums are a fantastic resource for talking about HDR photography, including panorama. I know we didn't have a chance to cover that today. I know Chuck was looking forward to that point out from Sports Shooter. Christian is...
We're hoping to have you back for another webcast soon.
That'd be great. That'd be great. The book is in pre-orders on Amazon, and I had a lot of fun doing this. I hope I made a lot of sense. I tried to cover a lot of ground and tried not to ramble too much. And again, I welcome you to join me over on Facebook at facebook.com/HDR Photography. Join the discussion, have some fun, ask questions. I try to talk to people as much as I can. I love talking about photography, as anyone who knows me can attest. And, I look forward to seeing you on Twitter, on Facebook, on Vimeo, wherever. And thanks a lot. Everybody go out and enjoy making some photos and come over and share them over on Facebook.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you everyone else for joining us. I hope that you can have it. You'll take a chance to give us some feedback on our post-event survey. It's very short, and we appreciate the feedback. It helps us fine-tune the whole webcast process for other people. Yeah, I'm ready for the fire drill. Should happen any minute. So I'm going to close the meeting out in a minute. We'll send everyone a link as soon as the recording's available. Hopefully that will be before Monday, but it may be as late as Monday. So once again, thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you. I had a lot of fun with this.